So, most horror films are all about a fear of an external force, a fear of being killed, a fear of a monster or a slasher or a ghost or something like that, right? And so, the film that we're going to be talking about today kind of flips that idea on its head, and it uses fear of us, of you, of me, of the viewer, the fear that we could all kill. We could all become the monster of the story. And of course, I am talking about Kiyoshi Kurosawa's Cure from 1997. Bong Joon-ho, the legendary director, actually was quoted to say this when talking about the film, that it is violence treated as deeply human. I think that that is such a great way to encapsulate what this film does so effectively. And so, as I said, this film is from Kiyoshi Kurosawa, and it is, in my opinion, a criminally underdiscussed masterpiece. And I think that sort of the reason is that Cure kind of came in that sweet spot just before films like Ringu and the Ju-on films like, The Grudge and things like that. It kind of came out before this explosion of Japanese horror in Western audiences. So it kind of gets shelved to the background, more so than I think that it should. Even from my own personal experience as a film student, film students don't really talk about him. And in my opinion, although he doesn't have the same amount of popularity or exposure as these guys, he matches up to a Carpenter, a Cronenberg, a Kubrick, a Hitchcock. He is sort of in that tier for me personally. This film sort of asks us this human question that I kind of talked about earlier, which is, what if we could kill? What if we were close to it and we didn't even know it? What if we were the monster? And it sort of asks us this question in a really, really intrusive way through kind of hypnotizing the viewer. And what I kind of want to dissect in this video is sort of how the film hypnotizes the viewer. What techniques are used in terms of the form, or in terms of the filmmaking aspects. And that includes really everything from its use of silence, the dichotomy between passive noise and no noise at all, to its extremely long wide shots where we are sort of observing these characters from afar, and the really ingenious and very consciously placed framing, and its repetitious storytelling, and of course the really, really awesome diegetic sound design. You'll notice when we're dissecting this film that it almost has a lack of a score, and that's something that I think is really, really well used here. Using diegetic sounds, meaning sounds that are coming from within the film's world, to its advantage as its own sort of score that we can consciously feel along with the characters. The film doesn't ask who is the killer. Instead, this film is asking, who are you? So how does Cure feel? So Cure really almost hypnotizes the viewer in the same sort of way that our antagonist Maima does, by taking filmmaking techniques themselves as sort of psychological. So he slowly kind of conditions the viewer by using this repetition, silence, rhythm, duration, and this ambient sound. The movie slowly puts us into the same psychological state as his characters this way. Like the first crime scene, for example. In American thrillers, you would be able to feel the chaos. You would be inside of it. You would have fast cuts, dramatic coverage, close-ups everywhere, and Here, it's just one wide shot. The room just breathes. We're sort of detached from it, right? The atmosphere sort of absorbs us. And here we can see firsthand that, at least in my opinion, the cuts matter more because the film is so much more restrained. When we finally cut to the corpse with the X symbol on it, kudos to the editor. As far as, a sense of rhythm and timing, the editor knows exactly when to cut. And this is their name here. Well, another great example of this, and one of my favorite scenes in the film, is the beach scene. So we have this extreme wide angle that is just incredibly uncommon. I mean, you just don't see this, especially in, this is a late 90s film, and Japanese cinema, and specifically Japanese horror, does typically, they are more restrained as far as their shooting techniques and framing goes. But even still, the wide shot just lasts for so long, and it just makes the viewer feel extremely distant, detached, and sort of voyeuristic. And paradoxically, it kind of draws you in more, right? It makes you kind of lean forward. To add like a small cultural point for this beach scene as well, prolonged eye contact is not really a huge thing in Japanese culture. In fact, believe it or not, it is just culturally not something you see. It's more confrontational than the Western viewer might kind of feel that it is in that culture. And so this man who's standing directly in front of this teacher and just looking at him is just kind of deeply unsettling. And I think you can totally see that translate. You just feel a bit off. And I don't know, man. I don't know if it's just me, but I kind of get that way all the time, anyways. Like, I don't know. It's like people stare at you sometimes. Like, have you ever pulled into the gas station and there's just somebody like kind of looking at you, and you look down and like shut your car off or whatever, and you get out and like they're still staring at you? I don't know, man. It kind of unnerves me. Here we have an absence of a score, but just letting that all that ambient noise really fill out the space. You just feel so immersed in it. And I think that honestly, uncrowding this film and letting it breathe is so important when it comes to the sound design. I think that people often underrate how important sound design is in film. And this is a prime example of it really making the scene. And especially on rewatch, this entire film is just, it adds a total different layer. In the first viewing, Mayima feels like an amnesiac, right? And you as the viewer are sort of placed in the teacher's perspective where you're just like, what? But on rewatch, he is actively and very consciously controlling the entire situation and conversation. Another scene that I really love here is the laundromat. You have frame within a frame everywhere, as you can kind of see in the opening here. The hangers here, you can sort of see that they separate the characters visually, and it's just such a brilliant, conscious use of, the power of photography and the frame within a frame aspect of almost segregating these characters. You sort of see the thematic elements come through here as well with this guy, and he's just sort of angrily muttering under his breath, and he then immediately, returns to being polite once his clothes arrive. And so this kind of showcases the entire idea behind the film, right? Civilization as this sort of restraint. Everybody in society is just on the edge, but inside, and one step away from being non-functional. Here you can see, and throughout the rest of the film, that Mayima is not creating this violence in the viewer's mind. In fact, the psychiatrist actually says so.
催眠法自体はありふれた技術だ、しかしな、いくら催眠状態に入っているとしても、その人間の基本的な倫理観は変えることはできない。つまり殺人を悪だと思っている人間に人を殺せというテーマは暗示できないよ。
And so the sound design, again, the dryer motif throughout this film, I just really love. The dryer noise just feels so looming. It's mechanical, it's rhythmic, it's repetitive. So you can see here that the sound design really is the score here. It's kind of like No Country for Old Men, but it's even more invasive because there's not a lot of actual action that happens in this film. A lot of it is on the surface slow and restrained, whereas No Country for Old Men, sure, it's silent around what these characters are doing, but oftentimes it is very actively tense, whereas this film just is so much more subliminal as a whole. Another scene that I am super excited to dissect here is the faucet hypnosis scene. I just love it because you get these key little details that just make everything, like the water dripping slowly, the pipes are sort of squeaking rhythmically, and the black floor makes like the translucent water feel very like venomous as it's like slowly sort of approaching her. And that's not actually the only time that we see a sort of black water motif as well. Here, the viewer is getting hypnotized as well because one thing that the camera certainly knows in Cure is that it has active control over what the viewer can see. And obviously, this sounds understandable to us at first. Like, yes, of course, we're forced to see whatever the camera sees. But using it in this active way where we are being forced to look at the water as our character is here, it kind of gives us no choice but to feel hypnotized. And then, of course, you can go into sort of gender readings about this scene being water translating to femininity, and the sort of masculine domination that you can see here. And that is the root of the character. The ambient noise that we become so accustomed to that we kind of forget that it's even there suddenly just sort of drowns out and we hear nothing. It is just such an amazing way to draw the viewer in. And I think that horror could definitely use more silence and less score and jump scares and noise. I think that that's way scarier. And you could sort of see this again in the headquarters scene where the other voices drown out and only Mayuma is audible.
あいつら何にも分かってないんじゃない？俺のこともあんたのことも。ケイさん、俺の声聞こえてる？
In the opening, we have the opening title music. It's this like cheerful, upbeat, happy-go-lucky music over this urban decay. And it just creates such an interesting dichotomy because you have this visual and auditory contradiction. It just creates this sort of sense of unease. One of the only other times that we actually get a score in the film is the bus scene, which is this very romantic piano score, and it feels wrong. And accompanying the scenes directly before it, you get this sort of breakdown from the main character with this sort of domestic subplot of his wife. And so, yeah, the music, it feels very heavenly and dreamlike. And when you are shown, the scene directly beforehand, you think that Takabe is going to kill his wife, especially as you're sort of being taken in this bus. The mind automatically wants to sort of translate that to some sort of heavenly ascension or something like that, as if Takabe is basically leading his wife into the afterlife, saying, we won't go to Okinawa and things like that. And it's just a really ingenious use of the score here. And so the film often will lie or mislead the audience in a very interesting way. So now I want to talk about something that I think that this film does really well, which is how do you portray violence in a minimalistic way, right? Because this film is very sparing, as we've already talked about, with all of the filmmaking techniques, both visually and auditorially. This is juxtaposed with what's actually happening on screen. And so we can take examples like the cop shooting scene, which I just love. It's no buildup, no dramatic payoff. And it's just one static shot. And I just think that this is another really great example of showcasing this violent scene, but just showing us. We're not trying to pepper it or season it with all of these, different camera angles and a suspenseful buildup and score. No, it is just showing us what is happening. It's a really neat way to showcase human violence. And another little tiny note I have here is that the gun sound it's just like a realistic, like high pitched pop instead of this like cinematic explosive gunshot that you typically hear in these films. And I'm not a big gun enthusiast, so correct me if I'm wrong, but to my understanding, actual gunshots don't sound like they are showcased in this film, just pop. And that's it. The casualness really does make it all the more horrifying. And then the set design is also something to note, not just in this scene, but in general. But even in this scene, we can see the sort of hypocrisy of the no more gun sign. It just kind of shows this violence creeping in beneath this institutional order. And then, of course, we have the suicide scene, right? It's just one exterior shot, no montage, no fancy techniques used. It is just a long shot of bam. And so if you compare this to, say, the shower scene in Psycho, you have, 63 shots, I believe, that are shown in 15 seconds. I'm probably off on that, but it's something like that. It's akin to Russian montage, where basically you're breaking these rules in order to show us all of these consecutive shots that are sort of fragmented and that give us a very, very specific feeling. And Kurosawa kind of does this in the inverse by withholding and letting moments dwell and linger. You kind of get this feeling that minimalism is being used as more effective and more disturbing than creating a spectacle out of violence, right? The violence that takes place in this film and in this society is just so much more muted and less of a spectacle. And then I also want to give a quick shout out to the practical effects in this film. So you have like the female doctor murder scene, and it's really convincing practical effects, especially for it only being shown extremely briefly. Unlike a Cronenberg, where the practical effects and the set pieces and everything like that is sort of the spectacle of the film, it gives us a very different sort of vibe, right? It barely emphasizes the gore, but it makes it feel more real, more intrusive, and almost as like an accidental thing. And I also think that you can even analyze even a short scene like this and really see that everything is just being so consciously placed here. You have this sort of male coded space with the male restroom, and you have a woman that is dissecting a man inside of it. And this is further punctuated by the previous scenes that we have with Mayama and this female doctor. So you kind of have those thematic elements in play, and that's reflected through the set as well as it is through the story itself. And I kind of want to briefly talk about the color design as well. You have these muted greens, grays, and very cold interiors. And then you'll get these splatters of blood and violence, which briefly interrupts the frame. And I think that the color red is just really beautifully used here. As a director of photography myself, and someone who understands how important color design is in film, I can see how much care is put into this very muted palette with these splashes of red, because even beyond the blood motif that we see from the corpses and the murders, you also get really cool scenes like the second time that we go to the laundry vat with Takabe, this red dress that's sort of floating towards him. And another scene that I want to shout out is the one that takes place right before the bus scene. The camera actually goes handheld, which is not something that Kurosawa typically does, and he certainly doesn't do that in this film. But in this scene where you kind of get this domestic breakdown coming to a head, we kind of follow the tension, seeing the raw meat, the upside down plates, and very sort of shaky camera work and movement. It makes this emotional sort of tension that we've been building up just feel huge. Through this, we can sort of see the form and the technique shifting and changing alongside with the plot and the narrative. But all of these techniques ultimately serve as something much larger than the atmosphere, right? Because underneath the murders and hypnosis, Cure is really asking terrifying questions about identity, repression, and what human beings might secretly be capable of. So now for the next section of the video, I sort of want to talk about what makes Cure so disturbing is that it doesn't treat violence as something that's supernatural or alien. As I said before, violence is really treated as more human and ordinary and very like latent, like it's in all of us, right? And so I think that that is what makes Mayama such an interesting antagonist, is that he's not creating the violence in this film. He's exposing it. He's bringing it to the surface of these people, and he's giving them permission to act on their subliminal impulses. This kind of gives us this idea that civilization and society at large, at least in this film, is more of a performance than it is a reality. And you can see this when the police officer is questioned. He says that he hated his partner. He was lazy. He was always covering from him. What's kind of funny here is that earlier scenes actually suggest that the opposite is true. He's the one that takes the smoke break and says it's okay to smoke while on duty or while in the police box. And so the hypnosis almost seems to like reshape reality and perception itself. And it just kind of goes to a larger point of the victims of this hypnosis rationalizing the violence after the fact. These victims aren't just randomly targeted. Mayama doesn't just hypnotize them to attack anybody. It's with purpose. A touch that I really love in this film, and that's one of the most disturbing parts of it, is that these victims remember everything. They aren't possessed traditionally, and they remain conscious throughout the entire act of doing it. Why that's terrifying is it removes this sort of safety of a sort of possession or insanity or a blackout. No, it's a key line from the film itself, which is it just felt right to these people. And so I think the core question in this film is, who are you? Mayama even says it himself.
いいか、もう一度聞くぞ。本部長の藤原。あんたは誰だ？
君、私の何が聞きたいんだ？
それは自分で考えろ。
That question isn't framed as what is your name. It is framed as what is the you behind all of the performances. What is the deeper meaning? What is the reality of who you are? And in that way, Mayama feels much more like a prophet, as he is even helmed by the psychologist or psychiatrist, is trying to spread this actual objective reality, and doing so through the mesmer techniques of hypnosis. In an interview relating to the film, Kurosawa actually said he isn't sure that identity truly exists. And I think that that's really interesting to think about while watching this film. People are constantly shifting who they are every day. I do it, you do it. I think everybody does it, right? You have your work self, you have your home self. I have my student self, I have my romantic self, and my public self. And those are just, at the end of the day, facades of identity that are created by us in order to function in society. And so the question here is, if identity is just always changing and it's this constructed thing that we see ourselves as, what actually is our real self? And that is exactly what the horror of this film is about. And Takabe is a prime example of this, right? At work, he's focused, competent, and controlled. But in his home life, he is exhausted, frustrated. He's a caregiver, and we see a much more unstable side of him. And so the insight here is he the same person then, or are these multiple different people? I also kind of want to talk about the psychiatrist arc that is not really in the forefront of the film, but is definitely noticeable. In the beginning, he is very detached and sort of the skeptical character, but by the ending, he is obsessed and consumed by Maima's doing. The point here is that knowledge doesn't really protect him, and understanding the mind only makes him more vulnerable. In trying to search for the answer or the understanding in psychology, he's kind of missing that it is all a human construct in the first place. Let's also talk about the X symbol. I think that possible meanings here, at least from what I can sort of gain, is maybe it's sort of a visual cue of something being crossed out, and that something would be our identities. Characters that were hypnotized by Maima react very instinctively to this X. Even regardless of what it means, it is just such a really nice way to succinctly showcase this symbol of what is happening to these people and leaving a physical mark of that. Why does Takabe resist? Why is he able to? And I think that that's just because he's a very obsessive and convicted and strong-willed character. And you see this archetype a lot with detectives and these sort of thrillers, right? They are on a one-track mind and nothing really shakes or rattles them from the goal that they are set on. What's so interesting is that Takabe already does possess all of these qualities that sort of make other people susceptible to Maima's influence, right? He has resentment, exhaustion, and this buried anger. And so another important point is that the film doesn't go a supernatural route, but it also doesn't really go a scientific route either. In fact, I think that the film does a really cool job of sort of giving us both sides here. The film is always blurring science, psychology, mysticism, and ritual. And I think that the key theme here is that magic might just be something that can be understood psychologically. And so in the final stretch of the film sort of stops functioning purely as a detective story. It kind of starts functioning more like this psychological contagion, right? And I know a lot of people have talked about the pacing of the story kind of feeling off in the final stretch after Takabe drops his wife off, and we kind of move on to this final sort of climax and set piece. And one thing that's always been a bit hard for me to square about this film too is that ending, just because you do feel that rupture. But I think about it less now as something that impedes the film, but more so as something that kind of aids it in a really interesting way. And one thing that I think that we see more throughout this final stretch is that Maima isn't really, I don't think he necessarily understands everything either. He's not some evil mastermind, and he's more so a sort of empty and transformed person, and he's just trying to spread that transformation. And I think that he ultimately does do so through Takabe. He sort of inherits this emptiness. But nowhere are these unstable identities and hidden fractures more visible than inside Takabe's own home. And I think that that's something that often gets overlooked in this film, which is that subplot of his domestic life, and something that directly aids the thematic content of the film itself. And so all of these things that we're sort of talking about here, all of this emotional emptiness and psychological instability, it didn't emerge in a vacuum. Cure arrived during a major transition in Japanese horror itself. It was a moment where horror was becoming quieter, more psychological, and much more existential. And that is, I think, partially why Japanese horror blew up kind of directly following this film with the aforementioned films like Ringu. So the film feels very modern now, but in 1997, it was actually doing something that was really radically different when you look back on the time. 1980s Japanese horror was very exploitative, graphic, loud, colorful, and chaotic. And that was just sort of drawn from these sort of Western horror landscape during the 80s. You know, we're talking about like splatter films, grindhouse films, and ultimately, all of these things sort of derive from the 70s giallo films that inspired the Western gold rush of slashers. Violence was becoming a spectacle in these films a lot of the time. And not that that's a bad thing, or not that that's a less important thing. I think that to make death into a sort of beautiful ballet is a really, really interesting and valuable skill. Real life murders and crime waves in Japan created a sort of cultural anxiety around violent media. And horror was increasingly viewed as exploitative and morally kind of dangerous and gray. And this wasn't only felt in Japan, this was felt around the world, even going back to the video nasty in England, where they would ban certain films. By the 90s, horror actually takes a turn, partially due to this, and it starts shifting inward psychologically. And this is kind of where the rise of modern J horror comes from. The important sort of aspects and points and the core transformation from the exploitative horror in the 80s to the 90s was that horror became quieter, slower, more atmospheric, psychological, and existential. And so fear moves away from look at this horrifying and gruesome thing and more so capitalizes on sit with this terrible guttural feeling. Cure definitely feels different from later Japanese horror films. And why is that? Well, it's partially because it's less supernatural. It's more existential, more procedural, and more philosophical. And so, for some context as well as to why this film was so effective and possibly why certain aspects of it were made in the first place in the way that they were, some of it might have to do with the Tokyo subway attack, which spawned a lot of social anxiety from 1995.
13 people were killed and some 6,000 others made violently ill in the attack, deemed the worst act of domestic terrorism in Japan's modern history.
It was basically a gas attack that caused a lot of collective fear and paranoia in Japan. There was a lot of anxiety about hidden violence and ordinary people that were radicalized to do these extraordinary things. Cure, I think, really reflects and capitalizes on that societal fear that anyone could suddenly become extremely dangerous. Briefly, I kind of want to talk about Kurosawa before Cure as well. Kurosawa was already a veteran filmmaker before Cure. So he's not some sudden Quentin Tarantino making Reservoir Dogs one hit kind of guy. He actually did a insane amount of TV work originally and straight to video or V cinema, which was very popular in the 80s in Japanese cinema and especially in Japanese horror. And he was always very into genre filmmaking and horror filmmaking at that. This is just so important because you can feel the technical confidence in Cure. Every cut is just so deliberate and conscious, and every frame feels controlled to be exactly what the filmmaker wants you to see. And of course, that's not just due to Kurosawa, that's due to the entire cast and crew, obviously, but this ship was running on all cylinders, and a film like this just really shines through for that conscious and succinct use of all of the aspects and techniques of filmmaking in order to create the exact right formula. Kurosawa has this reoccurring fascination with couples. They occur constantly in his work. I think that he is very interested in intimacy, emotional distance, and unknowability, but Cure treats love very sincerely, but also incomplete, unstable, and impossible to fully resolve. So I think why this film kind of crossed international is that it's accessible enough for genre audiences, but it's deep enough for art house audiences. And I think that that's just such a rare balance for films. You know, you can watch this on multiple levels. And I would say that for some audience members, a film like this might be considered boring just because of its pacing, how it's shot, and everything like that. But on another level, it is just such a rare balance to be able to sit down, watch a film, have fun with it, and for it to have that sort of art house flair. And another kind of small little observation I would like to make is that in the original Japanese trailer, the film uses piano score and it's very focused on mood. It really gives almost nothing away.
間宮が一体何者なんだ
伝道師
伝道師
世の中に知識を広める
In my personal opinion, this is the way trailers should be. They should not tell you anything about the film beyond what you are going to be getting into tonally. That's my personal belief. And that's why I kind of think modern trailers suck because they give away way too much. But anyways, it preserves the mystery and the atmosphere of the film. And in the American trailer, that kind of shifted. It uses diegetic sound very rhythmically with this train dinging and the mechanical sound sort of cutting and editing along with the cutting of the actual film. And so you can kind of see the difference here. The American marketing was much more focused on tension, mechanics, and sort of the thriller energy of by the end of Cure, the mystery is technically solved. We understand the hypnosis element, we understand Mayama's methods, the murders, the psychological manipulation, all of it. But the movie never becomes comforting. If anything, it becomes even more unsettling because the final stretch intentionally feels slippery and difficult to fully square logically. By this point, the police, the hospitals, the psychiatry, the institutions themselves are psychologically collapsing themselves. The hypnosis becomes systemic. It becomes something that's greater than Mayama messing with one individual person. And I think that you can see this reflected visually with the banging scene where, Mayama's banging on the pipes and sort of illuminating this entire building with the same like rhythmic diegetic sound that we've become so used to being a hypnosis technique in this film. Killing Mayama ultimately changes almost nothing. It kind of shows us that Mayama was never the true source of the violence. The violence already existed inside these people. And after Mayama's caught, after he's already dead, you see this emptiness reflecting in Takabe. And even beyond that, you see this string of violence still carry further as a woman witnesses the X mark. The final shot of the film ends with picking up a knife. And it doesn't give you much, it doesn't show you anything. That just goes to show that the violence is in us. It was never something that Mayama created. And I think that that's such an interesting aspect of the film because it never really tells us who the monster is. It only asks us who we are. If you guys even made it all the way through, then please leave a comment. I love to talk about films and horror films in specific. And if you're watching this video, then I'm sure you do too. I would just love to thank you guys for watching my film I made last year, Compliance, which is sitting at somewhere around 70K views. It's awesome, man. That's more than I ever thought that I would get on anything, And also, if you guys have any suggestions or video ideas that you want me to cover, please let me know. Until then, sit back, relax, and keep watching horror movies.